yes, it's great to have classical music concert halls, and there's an absolute place for that, don't get me wrong. But alongside that, yeah, on a Thursday night, Friday night, they want to go axe throwing. Well, we've got to be able to offer that as well. We've probably got the best public transport system in the world. The Elizabeth line has given 1.4 million people extra within the southeast a 1 hour access point to central London. Right? That's an extra 1.4 million potential employees. They're an hour's commute away on an Oyster card tap. Experiential leisure offerings are probably the only way you can get retail to work today. I'm Shravan Joshi. I'm the Chairman of Planning and Transportation at the City of London Corporation. What that means is that we look after the built environment in the square mile of London and the transportation and the infrastructure that goes with it.
Shravan, thank you so much for joining us. Urban Forecast is a podcast about the future of cities, and we're delighted to be joined this episode by Shravan Joshi, MBE, Chair of the Planning and Transportation Committee at the City of London Corporation. Shravan has led the City of London's Vision 2040 framework, which will define the way the City of London will continue to evolve for the next 20 years, which we will come to. But we would like to start, as we do on all these podcasts, by delving into the background of our guests. So could you tell us how your sort of early career and upbringing kind of led you into this role at the City of London dealing with the built environment and transportation?
Sure. Thanks for having me on, and hello to your audience. I started, my very first job was actually in the city. I was at 1 Appold Street, and I sort of came out of university with a degree in chemistry, and that was enough to put me off wanting to do chemistry as a career. And so oddly jumped into investment banking, did that for a few years, and that led me into the energy sector, where I spent most of my career. Funnily enough, in those days when I started working in the city, I had no idea that there was a thing like the City Corporation, or that there was any sort of difference in regulation or structure or governance that I now know much more about. And it's interesting, I think most people who work in the city are probably oblivious to that as well. So my career went on to the energy sector. I was working in trade finance and sort of technology and business development all over the world for a couple of decades in that sector, and saw that change from being very sort of fossil fuel led into that new emerging territory of renewables and new engineering and new technology emerging around that sort of renewable sector, which is now, it's all over the media, and everyone's now aware much more of how that transition's happening towards decarbonisation. During that, I got involved with the livery companies in the city, which again, most people have no clue about, but these are the ancient guilds that ran trade and standards in the square mile, in the city, in the old city of London. And I got involved with the energy sector livery company, which is called the Fuelers Livery Company, and worked my way through the ranks of that. And I became the president, effectively the master of the company for a year. It's a revolving presidency each year. And that is the first time I really got exposed to the City Corporation and learned a little bit more about the fact that there is this modern entity that looks at the governance and the running of the city as a growing economy and a centre of economic growth, as opposed to just the traditional guilds that used to run it. And so when I finished my year as the master of the company, I thought, right, this is what I want to do. I want to get more involved in the modern day city. And I stood for a by-election in 2018 and got elected. And then 2.5 years ago, was elected chairman of planning. It's a 3-year term, and I've got about 6 months left.
And you mentioned the sort of unique structure of the city, the unique way that it's governed. Do you want to just expand a bit about how it works on a kind of day-to-day? Like
any other local authority, we have a statutory role as a planning authority and as a strategic transport authority. So we have those roles like anyone else does. I suppose the uniqueness of the square mile is the makeup of our built environment. And it is very, very office-led. It is very commercial-led. And whilst we have about 9,000 residents who are absolutely critical our existence. It's the 618,000 workers that commute in every day that really cause the built environment to look and feel the way that it does. And then we have to look after the transportation side to make sure people can sustainably and with a low carbon impact move in and out of the city, because we don't have lots of workers living in the square mile. We have to work very closely with Transport for London, Network Rail, all of those service providers to make sure we can get people in and out effectively every day.
And then just one more question before John sort of goes on to talking about the vision is in terms of your actual role, chair of the Planning and Transportation Committee, what does that specifically entail on a kind of day-to-day?
Yeah, day-to-day, it's an interesting role. I suppose a lot of it is, we have our regular committee cycles. So the approach I've taken in my term is that we have to be responsive to the market. So if we see that planning applications are coming forward, we will assign committee meetings to meet that market demand. So we may have periods where we don't have a lot of planning meetings, and then periods when actually it gets very, very congested. And then that causes its own turbulations with members and the administrative side of it. But actually, I think it's really important that we are seen to be market responsive in that sense. So we have the cycle of committee meetings. In between that, it is very much around the officer side, really running that sort of pre-app planning process as the planning authority. I suppose my role within that comes much closer to an application maturing and reaching committee and giving, I suppose, a political steer on whether schemes will carry weight or not at committee. And so, along with my deputy chairman and senior officers, we will be engaging with developers as their schemes mature to make sure that they're sort of congruent with wider policies that we have in the city. I also tend to do quite a lot of outward work representing the square mile, representing, I suppose, commercial real estate in the city, promoting the square mile as the place for inward investment, because most of our investment actually comes from international money. I think it's about 95% of investment in commercial real estate in the square mile is from international funds.
Wow.
And so we have to have that outreach. We have to make sure our policies are understood, and hearing it from the horse's mouth is much more powerful than through third parties.
That's fascinating. Welcome. It's great to have you and see you again. I guess what I found really interesting was your description of your transition from maybe a fossil-based market to greener energies, and you're seeing the city with their new kind of Vision 2040 making that transition from maybe a kind of older type of building and cityscape to a newer type. Just wonder if you could tell us a bit more about that Vision 2040 and what it means.
Sure. I think if I go back a decade or so, when the world became acutely aware that we really have to deal with the carbon story, and we in the city took the approach of not declaring a climate emergency. Mm-hmm. We took the view that we would make a climate action plan as an executable strategy. Mm-hmm. And so we spent probably a good part of 2 years, 18 months or so, collecting data just to get a baseload, just to understand where are we at right now and what is the problem that we need to address. And out of that came about 3 or 4 streams. One was things like flood resilience, is a major issue for us. We as a square mile, we're right on the bank of the Thames, so that's a major issue for us is sort of that flood resilience piece. The other piece that came out of it was the huge impact of the built environment on decarbonisation, and the huge volumes of carbon embodied within our buildings, and of course the operational footprint that those buildings have. So from our perspective in planning, I suppose we really look at our carbon action plan in terms of what we can do in terms of policy to reduce those impacts. And where those impacts are necessary, that they are justified and they are quantified in a way that I suppose in the longer term will provide a more sustainable future for the square mile. So we started coming out with a bunch of SPDs, which were heavily consulted with the market. What we didn't want to do was end up in a position where we actually stifle growth. We had to make sure we could do growth responsibly. And so I think our SPDs that we've come out with, initially focusing on operational carbon, I think have been very successfully met by the market. We now start to see net zero footprint buildings coming through, buildings actually wanting to celebrate the sort of water harvesting and the solar plants and the fact they're on a district heating system. They want to celebrate those facts to drive good tenants into those buildings. What we're now facing up to is really that embodied carbon piece and how we're going to tackle that. And we've come up with a sustainability SPD that, as a policy, I think, again, allows us to have responsible growth in that space.
Yeah, no, it's a very good policy. It's very interesting. And I think what I find is the challenge there, it's sort of understanding the City of London is sort of, there's various towers that are going up and I think more that are coming, but you also it's got over 2,000 year history. And so how do you preserve that kind of history alongside kind of promoting future evolution?
I think this is probably the biggest challenge I've faced as chair, and I think it's a challenge that future committees will face as well, is getting that balance of heritage versus development absolutely right. And I don't think there is an absolutely right. I don't think there's an equilibrium that naturally will exist, because the market is constantly changing. The skyline of the city, the skyline of London for that matter, has changed year on year since I can remember. Yeah. And actually, to my mind, in a slightly odd way, if the skyline were to become static, I'd be very worried about the market, right? Yeah. You kind of want it to evolve and you want it to change. Against that backdrop, we have to make sure that the heritage sites that we have are celebrated, that they're accessible and that they're inclusive. And they also have to fit in to the sustainability argument as well. Yep. And then that's presenting one of the challenges, is that sort of heritage sustainability piece. But to me, one of the comments I often get from international visitors is they love that juxtaposition of those heritage buildings against the backdrop of skyscrapers. If you stand at Bank Junction, you look at the Royal Exchange, sort of stone building, with its beautiful pillars, and then right behind it, you've got that sort of eastern cluster of towers. And to me, that exemplifies the modern city, and it should, right? It personifies what we are today in that built environment. And I think I've even spoken to other local authorities that are looking at how to protect their views of the city skyline. So you're facing that odd position where suddenly that skyline is becoming something people want to protect views of. So we've just got to get that balance right. But what I say to people all the time is we cannot not have change. Yeah. What we need to do is make sure we have responsible change and change that is respectful of everyone.
No. Do you think that the sort of unique way that the City of London is structured allows a kind of closer alignment between politics and planning? And do you think that helps assist when putting forward a really ambitious vision? Rather than other boroughs that maybe get caught up into more tribal politics. So yes, I think there are a couple of distinguishing factors that we have. When I first joined this place, and you join, and I've been there about 6.5 years now, and still have no idea how to define it in a sentence. But I was told something that stuck to me was we are a corporation that has local authority responsibility. And if I look at it that way, some of it starts to make a bit more sense. So yes, we have our planning function, statutory function as a local authority. We then have a responsibility to make sure we drive growth within financial and professional services across the UK. And that's a citywide corporation responsibility, led by the Lord Mayor and the Chairman of Policy. But my view is actually commercial real estate that acts as the home and the headquarters of a lot of those financial and professional services firms is a key ingredient to their future success. So for me, as the planning chairman, promoting inward investment into commercial real estate absolutely fits as part of the equation
when the Lord Mayor goes out and talks about wanting to promote legal services and the insurance sector and banking and finance to the world is, well, we also, from my perspective, we want your home to be in the city.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the interesting thing that's, has been very strong in the city, and you've got previous, Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, talks a lot about green finance and kind of ESG funding. And I think, have you seen a shift from the corporations that you kind of interact with, and how is that impacting on your plans?
It's interesting. I saw a report just this morning that's come out. It was published in the press that we are again the leaders in green finance globally, which again is something I've known for a while. It's good to see the data reaffirming that. I think what you're finding is there is a lot of capital available for development and for the built environment, for commercial real estate. It wants to be applied in a much more categoric way that I suppose ESG is becoming a little bit more of a redundant term, but needs to be applied on that sort of environmental sustainable footing, right? We are seeing a huge growth in transition finance.
Yep.
And that is something that I welcome, because we are not at the end point right now where you have absolutely pure green built environment projects happening. We're not going to be there for a while. So actually I need finance available to still deliver projects in the meanwhile that are on the journey towards that sustainable end. And so for me, actually, green finance is great and it's applicable in many sectors. But for me, in the built environment sense, I think that transition finance is probably more critical.
No.
The advantage that I think the city has, again, over other local authorities, is that predominantly you're dealing with businesses. And I think there's a end user tenant demand for sustainable buildings, because companies often have it kind of in their articles that they will have a requirement to get, whatever categorization, be it BREEAM, they will they'll say we can only rent offices that are of this spec. And that's driving developers to develop that product. You don't have that as much in the residential sector, because if you're buying a house, your primary concern is not the EPC rating. And so that, I think, it allows you to, you're getting push, as well as you can use carrot and stick. You have this money is wanting to go to the place where the tenants want a sustainable product, which I think then helps you when you're coming up with these policies. Do you see challenges for other places where those sort of magic ingredients are slightly different?
I think there's been a change in the last year or so that I'll talk about first, and then come on to other areas of attraction and other cities. So I think what's happened in the last 12 months is we have seen the market demand, as you've rightly said, for what I call super prime. And super prime to me is property that has those sustainability credentials baked into their platform. So they're net zero, their energy is all green, they're electrified, they've decarbonised as much as they can. That to me is super prime, and it is commanding super rents, right? Yeah. That match. And that's very welcome, because you're now getting the pressure from the tenant sector driving that demand, and it's not just policy driven. So you're absolutely right, that carrot and stick. What's changed in the last year for me is that we are now seeing, I think it's about 54% of the applications approved in the last year have been retrofit, as opposed to redevelopment. And getting those retrofit projects to those sustainable credentials is a real challenge, but we're getting there. We're now seeing the balance is now shifted towards retrofit. And so whilst we say it's retrofit first, but not retrofit alone, the market is now adapting to that.
And is that from a viability perspective, do you think, or is it because you brought in policies that encourage retrofit first?
I think a bit of both. And I've been quite clear with my officers, when we start determining policy, we go out to market. We work very closely with City Property Association. We work with trade bodies that represent the sector. We take heed of macroeconomics. We try and listen as much as we can to make sure that the policies we come out with are pragmatic. We want to achieve X, Y, and Z in terms of sustainability, but we've got to make sure the market can actually deliver on that. There's no point having policies that are unattainable by the market, because you will end up in a position where you stifle all growth, not just in the built environment. So, your sort of question to me was around, where do I see other interesting opportunities in other cities? I think it is really about making sure that as policymakers, we are listening to what the market can actually deliver, and where we are creating bottlenecks as policymakers to realizing some of that work, we probably need to be more pragmatic and say, yeah, retrofit first. But there are cases where redevelopment is necessary. I think you can solve that a lot by having those discussions about carbon optioneering right up front. So as opposed to going down a pathway of entertaining an application, a pre-app, that you sort of, it costs a lot of money to go through these processes. And then you find the carbon story comes up and the whole thing gets killed.
Yep.
What we try and do is we try and have those pre-apps on sustainability right up front. And if you haven't got the quantification and the justification for redevelopment, the retrofit piece is where we're going to sit. And if they know that up front, if the investor and the developer know that up front, they're more likely to have a successful project. So I think there's a little bit of work that we as policymakers could do to encourage more growth across the UK that has that carbon optioneering much more transparent, much more visible, and much better expressed, so that the investment community and the development community know what they're getting into.
I think so. And I think, I've got two thoughts on that. One, which is, trying to get some sort of standardization across the way we kind of measure things, because there's all sorts of different ways, which creates a lot of work for the different consultants and developers, etc. But I think also with retrofit itself, which we do a lot of and very interested in, is sometimes you need to think about the building slightly different. You need to reframe maybe how the building is used or the use of it, because its kind of current use is no longer viable. So we're seeing some office spaces, say, for example, coming up in the City of London and being reimagined as co-living, hotel, other uses. And I think that is something that you've encouraged. And I'm just interested to hear about that journey.
Yeah, I think this goes back to lockdown, and it goes back to, I suppose, in fact, go back before lockdown. If I go back to about 2016, we'd already started to see hybrid working coming in. We'd already seen the drop off on Fridays at work across the sector. So it had started long before. What we saw during lockdown was that became catalyzed, right? Obviously, we were all at home behind our laptops on the kitchen table. And since coming out of lockdown, it's that reimagination of how an employer earns the commute that we've had to face, right? And I think employers have to earn the commute. They have to earn the not just the availability mentally of an employee, but also that physical presence. And I think there is a recognition around productivity and innovation where employers need the employees in the office space. But you've got to earn that. And if you want the best brains and the best minds and the best talent, the best skills in the world, you've got to create that work environment. But what we've discovered is, and this is true, and it sounds very logical in retrospect, is it's not just about the office, right? It's about the F&B, and it's about all the other offerings that you have around it. It's the leisure, the hospitality, the hotels, the education, the culture that also fit around the ecosystem of that office. So what we did was we have some grade B stock in the office that is not fit for purpose as office. We have taken the approach in the local plan that we will reduce the barrier on change of use for those into either hotel, cultural, or educational use. And so, if it's a retrofit scheme, we're happy to entertain those, and we think that fits nicely with the ecosystem. So we've chosen those three sectors because we think it helps the employer earn the commute.
What would you define as cultural? So like museums? Or...
I think it's funny.
Would it? Yeah. Is a music venue cultural? I think.
Absolutely, of course it is. I was amazed at how experiential leisure offerings are probably the only way you can get retail to work today.
Yeah.
right? So if I want the high street to be successful, it cannot just be a row of shops that, sell a variety of goods, but don't actually offer any sort of other experience. And what we found is when you start putting in your sort of, your indoor golfing and your indoor clay shooting and your indoor axe throwing and all the rest of it, and your museums, you actually create a much more vibrant retail atmosphere for people to enjoy. And of course, your food and beverage follows as well. And so what we've done is we've said, right, experiential is absolutely part of culture. We've got a list right now of a number of, sounds really horrible, homeless museums, but homeless cultural offerings that want to have a place to showcase their experience or their culture or their sort of unique offering. We're working very closely with developers to say, if you're doing a major scheme, you've got to have a cultural strategy built into your business plan. And we expect space to be given over to cultural use. A really good example of that is the Migration Museum that's coming into Crutched Friars on top of student accommodation. So again, change of use. Yeah. You're seeing a student unit going in with 3 stories of the UK's migration story being told at the base of that, which I think is really important. So yes, it's a mix of museums and sort of modern culture and heritage as well. And if I look at the average age of employee in the city, it's about 34, 35, something like that. It's really, really young population. Yes, it's great to have classical music concert halls and there's an absolute place for that, don't get me wrong. But alongside that, yeah, on a Thursday night, Friday night, they want to go axe throwing. Well, we've got to be able to offer that as well.
Can I talk about the cities? You have got a residential population, and I'd imagine there's quite a lot of demand for more of that. What's the kind of current thinking when it comes to intensifying that, or developing more residential in the city? And does it clash with that cultural offering? I think that's the question I was sort of getting at.
Yeah, so this is where I think you can't really look at the square mile in isolation. We don't exist in a bubble. We don't, we live within the ecosystem of London and the southeast, actually, and the UK more widely. We cannot provide everything on our doorstep within 1 square mile. We have a resident population of about 9,000 people, which is critical to us. It's really, really important. And we've got a resident reset policy to really put them front and centre in terms of what their needs are and what their future needs are. I think having that sort of CBD, that sort of central business district feel, is also really important for us. And the risk is, if we start pepper potting residential within that, we risk that integrity of that business environment. So I've got an insurance quarter, I've got a legal quarter. We have big banks that can operate with the innovators and the fintechs and the challenger banks in their ecosystems. And that's brilliant. It's nice to see that. When I got tech innovation happening in the city, you're getting clustering happen, like we have at Old Street Roundabout, right? You get all these firms coming in because they find that there's sort of an acceleration by that sort of clustering occurring. So I don't want to lose that vibrancy by pepper potting residential in. We've also got the very unique situation because we've got some amazing transportation links across London. I think we've probably got the best public transport system in the world. Just in the square mile, I've got 16 stations. I've got over 50 bus routes. I've got over 60 cycle routes. So the ability for people to move in and out sustainably is there. So that infrastructure is built in. So what we've got to do is make sure we keep investing in infrastructure so people from the inner city, people from the southeast can come in. And the Elizabeth line is the best example of that, right? The Elizabeth line has given 1.4 million people extra within the southeast a 1-hour access point into central London, right? That's an extra 1.4 million potential employees. They're an hour's commute away on an Oyster card tap. That's really, really important that we keep investing in that. So for me, because we have that infrastructure, I think we've got a good case to keep that vibrant business environment going.
I think it's really interesting because that sort of, how do you keep, many people have predicted the sort of demise of the City of London over different years, and actually, be it more recently with Brexit or whatever else, what I'm seeing, and certainly in our kind of inquiries and things, we're seeing more activity happening in the city now, and actually firms looking to move back into the city. And I think Could you talk a little bit more to that? What's happening? What do you think is going on there?
I think that there's a couple of pieces. I think there's probably a little bit of a perfect storm occurring around some of the European markets, some of the US markets, where the commercial real estate market is probably not that vibrant. It's going through its own issues. There's political instabilities that we seem to have overcome, right? In the latest election, we now seem to have a very stable government for the next term at least, and that's driving investor confidence. We're also seeing the Asian markets coming through a cycle where their economies are now starting to flourish and say, actually, we've got capital available for investment abroad. So there is that sort of perfect storm happening. Within the microcosm of London, I think we've probably got, as a city, really strong, transparent policies and line of sight to policies up to 2040 with our local plan that again builds investor confidence. So I think there's a little bit of a perfection going on in that circumstance. I think when I look at this against the backdrop of sustainability, we did some data on this, and we've worked out that a employee that's in a dense urban environment like a city has 8 times less carbon impact than anywhere across the UK, across the average in the UK. And so, just on that sustainability argument, you've got good grounds to want that urban densification. And I'm a big fan of urban densification. I was in Munich at Real Expo with other UK cities, Manchester, Liverpool, Leeds. There's a lot of UK cities there. And we were all on the same page around needing urban densification to drive economic growth. And I think that's a narrative the UK tells really well.
And do you think it's working? Because on one level, I think you're right and the city is successful, but I also think I hear it from a lot of developers, the cost now and the complexity and the kind of layer upon layer of legislation is still a kind of, a brake on growth. And, what would you think we could do to kind of maybe encourage more of this innovation if we're going to really hit these kind of visions?
I think you're right. I think there is a feel that policy is probably adds risk at the moment than decreases risk. And it's something that we've tried to avoid in the Square Mile with our policies. I think one of the most encouraging signs I've seen was the maiden speech given by Rachel Reeves when she got the chancellorship, focused on planning and infrastructure.
Yeah.
And I thought it was music to my ears. I did not expect her to have those 2 words within her maiden speech. And to have an entire rhetoric around wanting planning and infrastructure to drive economic growth, to me, cuts through a lot of the naysayers and those who don't want change and don't want evolution within our built environment, to say, actually, look, there's a more fundamental linear relationship here that people are missing, which is if you want economic growth, you've got to have a built environment that matches that. And commercial real estate is at the heart of it. You can build housing, you have to build housing. You then need places for those people to work.
Yeah.
And the argument on sustainability demonstrates to you that workplace should be in an urban environment.
Yeah, no, I agree. I suppose one of the things I'm thinking about, though, is how do we match up the vision with the challenges of the reality? And I suppose for me, I'm a big advocate of reducing VAT on retrofits, on other things like that. And I think also I'm a big advocate of maybe digitising the planning system more and combining building regs, planning. There's so many different pieces of legislation. Can we kind of condense or simplify it so that there's kind of streamlined systems? So how, because we're setting these 2040, 2050 targets for Paris, how do we actually get there? I think we need to actually be realistic. Our ambition is quite high and we're doing some really good stuff, but actually perhaps we need to do a bit more if we're really going to hit those goals.
You're right. There are some mechanics that have to be sorted out. So, for example, I think, yes, the planning process needs to be simplified and more, I suppose the process needs to be better understood. And so actually the City of London, along with Southampton, have won a grant from the government to do a digital planning framework.
Great.
And the idea would be that framework is then giving some consistency across the whole of the UK, that you can digitally port documents in to the planning system, and there's a consistency whether you are in, whether you're in Newcastle or Manchester or Yorkshire or Bristol or Bath or wherever you are, or London, there is a consistency around that digital planning platform. So we are working on that actively, and we're hoping to actually have some results early next year on that. We're working very closely with Southampton on that. The piece around retrofit and how we have a culture in this country where we don't really incentivize positive behavior through tax incentives. We have a sort of tax system that is much more about collection and revenue than is driven by saying what is good behavior and how do I incentivize that. When I was in the States, we talked to New York City and we talked to Boston and we talked to a number of other cities around the world. We're starting to see success points where they incentivize things like retrofit. They incentivize developers who've taken carbon stories into account and rewarded them with either tax breaks, or they will get the ability to go higher or wider or massing impacts and so on. And so I think there's some learnings there for us as well on how we might get around using tax and using that as in a more positive, constructive way. And I think, for example, I think VAT on retrofit is an area I've lobbied on in the past, and I will continue to lobby on. I think longer term, the challenges of retrofit are only going to get harder and harder, and we're going to have to incentivize the market to do so. And if the cost of capital to deliver that is so high that it just cannot be done, you're going to have stranded assets all over the place. And so you're better off actually taking a longer term view, allowing tax incentives to kick in, to realize those assets, deliver value, and then say, right, you know what, in the longer term, those will pay back to the economy.
I totally agree. I think it's very interesting what they do in New York. I think we're kind of coming to the end and wrapping up. So I think I'd be interested, obviously in your role, you get to visit some of the cities around the world and what other people are doing. Other than, of course, the City of London, what are your kind of favourite cities, and is there anything you'd like to share about them?
Yeah, I mean, I think I've been very lucky. We joined Opportunity London. We were one of the founding members of Opportunity London, and that's given me the opportunity to go with their steering board to various different places, conferences, and actually be taken around cities by the local authorities there, our peers, and that's given some huge insights. I was in Paris just after the summer, sorry. I was in Paris, and we looked at some of the legacy programs in place for post-Olympics, which to my mind, on a sustainability basis, are probably some of the best I've seen anywhere. We've seen places like New York, where they have a different planning system completely on zoning, and I'm not advocating that, but I think certainly some of the stuff they're doing has delivered some phenomenal neighbourhoods, new neighbourhoods, rejuvenated areas that were really run down, and are now, some of the most expensive real estate in the city. And how you realise that is amazing. And it's that partnership of public and private, especially in the States, that works really well. We've seen European cities like Paris, I think is proving to be an exemplar, actually. I mean, I was quite pleased when I heard that actually they'd ripped up the 15-minute city plan, but they've certainly got ideas on how to rejuvenate areas, and they have areas around Paris that need serious investment, and how you drive that growth, but still maintain that beautiful character of Paris as it always has been.
That's brilliant. Thank you very much. It's been great to have you on.
Yeah, thank you so much.
Thanks for having me.
If you enjoyed this conversation and want another great podcast about real estate, investment management and development, then check out the People Property Place podcast, where Matthew Watts, founder of Rockbourne, speaks to the movers, shakers, innovators and leaders in the real estate industry.